Good morning and welcome to Wilmington Friends Meeting, a virtual gathering of friends that is happening wherever you are right now. We have a self-directed service on our website, and I will put the link to that in the comments here, but I wanted to give a go at giving the sermon here. So I've never done this before. Please be patient with me. Our scripture reading is Mark 14, 32 through 42. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated, and he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, James, and John, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake for 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed and in the hands of sinners. Get up, let's be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And again, that's Mark 14, verses 32 through 42. I want a different kind of Jesus, but I need the one that this story offers. One of the best pieces of advice that I've ever received about leading memorial services was rooted in this story, and it went something like this. You can use any Bible passage as your funeral text, but the story that you need to be remembering as the preacher is the story of Jesus in Gethsemane. People are afraid that their grief and their fear are evidence of faithlessness, that if they were better Christians, they wouldn't be so shaken by loss. They can't imagine that their Savior would have desperately prayed for a cup of suffering to be taken away from him. They certainly can't believe that his prayer would have been met by God's silence. So if you leave people with the sense that Jesus disapproves of their grief or of their fear, or that Jesus wasn't grieved and afraid himself, then you haven't preached the gospel. You haven't shown them Jesus. I want a Jesus with a more can-do kind of spirit than that. I want a Jesus who is part perky cheerleader and part confident project manager. I want a Jesus who looks at a problem and says confidently every time, "I know how to fix that. Just let me handle it." And I want that Jesus, I think, because that's who I want to be. So here's a question for you. What do you think Jesus should have been? Do you think he should have been kinder to his disciples? A little more patient in explaining what was happening? Should he have been just less foolhardy to begin with and stuck with his preaching gig back in Galilee, not taken the risk? Or should he have explained things more clearly, gotten away from those mushy parables and just told people directly what was happening? Or maybe Jesus was wrong about this whole peacemaking scheme. Maybe a better realist would have known that for the protection of the weak, the strong have to meet violence with violence. So here are two claims that I would make about Jesus. 1, Jesus shows us what God looks like. And 2, Jesus shows us how to be human. We're all the image of God, and the story of Jesus shows us what living like the children of God looks like. So if you secretly suspect that Jesus did the wrong thing, You can let that be your teacher. You can ask what that suspicion says about who you are and the kind of salvation that you think you need. So in this deep dive of events from Holy Week that we've been on in this series, we've been looking at the story through the lens of resistance. What are we being called to resist as disciples of Jesus? And how are we being called to resist it? And why? Jesus shows us how to resist, and his disciples, quite often, show us what our mistaken attempts to resist look like. And in this story, both of those narrative threads are about experiencing the depth of human despair. Our translation says that Jesus was distressed and agitated, and that he described himself as deeply grieved. That's kind of clinical language, and it can distance us a bit from the story. Jesus also says that he is upset enough to die, and that makes it a little more real. It also, frankly, means that whatever Jesus is about is not the gospel of the stiff upper lip. That is another one of my favorite misconstruals of salvation, in which I pretend that I'm not currently aware of an emotion, or I'm not currently expressing it, and therefore it's not real. It's like some massive game that I'm trying not to lose. I honestly thought to myself this week that it was kind of nice to have to stay home, because it meant that all of my feelings could happen in my living room, and only my dog would see them. That's how committed I am to the gospel of the stiff upper lip, that a statewide stay-at-home order is preferable to having messy public emotions in a Kroger. But Jesus doesn't do that. He takes his disciples off on a prayer retreat. He's overcome with distress. He tells the truth about the pain in his soul. And then he leaves his friends in order to fall on the ground and pray. Have you prayed like that this week? That the cup that we're facing would pass? Jesus doesn't have any shame about it. He prays, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. But not what I want, but what you want." And when I read this story, I generally focus on that last piece, right? Jesus' willingness to accept the Father's will over his own. But what's standing out for me this week is that request in the middle. Take this cup away from me. I laid out this series before I had heard of coronavirus, I think, but I can't imagine a more relevant passage. The world is ending, danger is coming, and Jesus is awake to his own pain. He's feeling every bit of it, which is more than I do on a lot of days, even when there's not a global crisis. And he's handing all of it over to God. It's late, and they've just had a big meal, so let's not be too judgy, but the disciples are going to sleep. They're dozing off. Now, it's not like they could have just stopped at Starbucks on their way to Gethsemane, so maybe we shouldn't complain too much. But also, we know that one way that we respond to pain is by tuning out. It's a useful talent in some circumstances. If you have to walk on a sprained ankle, for instance, it is useful to have a brain that focuses on something other than ow, 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 ow. And if you really can't function, your brain will let you just pass out. That's also useful. You can't really accomplish anything like that, but at least you don't have to experience it. The disciples are doing a version of that. We all have our ways of avoiding the experience of pain. You can do it by consuming a constant stream of Netflix, or by getting cathartically angry at the news, or by making binders full of plans, or by just getting drunk. You can sleepwalk through your whole life, or at least the overwhelmingly difficult parts. Or you can resist that urge. Here's a long quote from a commentary, one that I think is worth absorbing. William Platcher writes, Jesus asks Peter, "Simon, are you asleep?" The juxtaposition of those names, they're right next to each other in the Greek too, calls our attention to the fact that Jesus does not use the name that he gave to his disciple, Peter. In one interpretation, this is because Peter is his name as a disciple, and as one who has fallen asleep and is soon to deny Jesus, he no longer deserves that name. I am less persuaded of this analysis, Platcher writes, because I follow the minority view that, in Mark, Peter, the name Peter, initially it evoked the rocky ground on which the seeds grow briefly, and not the church's solid foundation. It's not a high compliment that you could cease to deserve. And moreover, in Mark, this is the only time that Jesus addresses someone directly by name. So Platcher says that he thus reads it as a desperately human gesture. There's no more nicknames or titles. The night is dark, and Jesus is facing death, and so he reaches out to a friend, calling him by name. We get our name as friends from John 15. There, Jesus calls his disciples friends, and we extrapolate from this, and I think rightly, that means that we should be friends of everyone, as Jesus was a friend to all. But the original meaning was friends of Jesus. In order to really be Jesus' friend, though, Peter and the other disciples needed to be awake. There's a hard balance here. I rail often enough in my sermons about our unwillingness to take Sabbath seriously, to really rest, and I rail about it because I fail about it too. So I don't want to imply that we should be awake all of the time. That's not feasible and it's not healthy. But it's not like the disciples made a habit of dropping off to sleep. In the Gospels, it's just this one moment when Jesus was in agony and frightened and grieving and something well beyond sad, and they couldn't or wouldn't stay awake to it. 3 times Jesus asked his inner circle of disciples, to pray for him. And 3 times their eyes were heavy, and they couldn't stay awake. How do we resist falling asleep when the night is long and the grief is strong? I think the answer there is intimately tied to the naked awareness of Jesus' prayer. The Jesus I want knows all of the answers and isn't worried about anything, but the Jesus I need is one who is grieving and afraid and flinging himself on the ground to pray for deliverance. The Jesus I need, and the Jesus I think you need, is the one who has prayed in the vulnerable way that we all need to be praying. The Jesus who shows us who God is the one who wants to avoid pain but is willing to take it on, who is overcome with grief and yet not deterred from his mission. And the disciples that Jesus needs in that moment are the ones who are awake and present to the pain of the situation. So here are my queries for you, whether you are settling into waiting worship or resuming your scroll through Facebook. What does the story of Jesus in Gethsemane teach you about being human? How are you resisting the temptation to fall asleep? And how is this moment calling you to pray and to be a friend?